So we're going to talk about cell phone data and what it tells us about the real number of Mormons attending church every Sunday. And this was a study that came out about 7 months ago, but it was just picked up by Jana Reese in the Salt Lake Tribune. And the title is How Many Mormons Are Actually in Church Every Week in the US? And it's really fascinating how they were able to sort of figure this out. Let's go to our next slide. So basically, self-reporting by Mormons, this is great. This means that surveys ask Mormons, how often do you go to church? So Pew Research, more than 3/4 of U.S. members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints describe themselves as attending church at least once a week. So over 75% say, of course, I go to church every week. Of course I do, right? Self-reporting, keep in mind. I know, Arthur's shaking his head. Did you read my notes? You must have read my notes. So the B.H. Robert Foundation, 71% of Mormons who live in LDS areas of the U.S. attend church weekly, and 65% who live outside of the United States attend, or the geographic strongholds of Mormonism, I guess, the Morador corridor, attend weekly. So again, self-reporting. Most of them say I'm there every week. And Jana Reese, of course, did her own study with her book, The Next Mormons. And in her study, self-reporting, again, 74% of members of the church said that they do attend weekly. This is back in 2016. So Mormons are saying, of course we're there. We're supposed to be there. We have to be there. We are there. But we're about to find out that may not necessarily be true if we move on here. So this is really interesting research that somebody named Devin Pope has done. And he's right. It's a journal article that's going to come out called Religious Worship Attendance in America, Evidence from Cell Phone Data. And he actually collected data on many, many denominations. But of course, he himself is active Latter-day Saint. And so he kind of focused on that. So he tracked the cell phones of 2.1 million Americans over nearly a year. This is from April of 2019 to the pre-pandemic month of February 2020. Now, this is an observation. All this is pre-pandemic. So I feel that anything we learn from this, we can absolutely extrapolate that the numbers are far worse than this because this is post-COVID. Pope says that smartphones that use location services, such as weather apps or Google Maps, allow our phones to track over the whereabouts, and this information is pinged to cell phone towers every few minutes. So since more than 90% of Americans have a smartphone, there's a startling amount of information available about where we are and what we are doing. So basically, they can track your cell phone. If you're sitting in the pews in a Mormon building, they can tell how many of you are there and how often you are there and where else you go. So his findings are measuring the religious attendance of different groups like Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, and even Buddhists. So if we go on, we'll get into specifics here. So what can we learn from about the LDS from all this data? So as you probably guessed, RFM was shaking his head. Far fewer Latter-day Saints attend church weekly than say they attend. And he even gave a weekly attendance sort of latitude, like illness, travel, circumstances where you might not be there. His criteria was if you attend at least 36 weeks of the year. Through his study, he's going to call you a full-time attender if you attend 36 weeks of the year. So even with that extra leeway, there's only about a third as many LDS weekly attenders. That's 0.29% of the United States population as the number who claim to be LDS weekly attenders in the surveys, which would be 0.87%. And I understand that. If people said to me, do you go to church every Sunday? I'd say, yeah, of course I do. Because you're not really thinking it through, right? How often are you home? The kids are sick, or you might have to go to another ward, or you're there late. I can understand why people may actually think that they do go all the time when they don't. Let's go to the next slide. So this is interesting, and I need to scoot my graph over there a little bit. But compared to the U.S. population, attends at least once a month, 21% of people. Okay, so Latter-day Saints, 39. So they are higher as far as attendance than the average other person that goes to another church. Attends at least once a week, 5% of the U.S. population, and Latter-day Saints, 15%. So it's higher than other denominations, but still 15%. What do you guys think about that number?
I think it's amazing that we've reached a point in Mormon history where we're cheering the number 15.
That's great.
It is lower than I would have expected it to be. I would have said the activity rate of those who attend essentially weekly would be significantly higher than 15, but yeah, I'm a little surprised.
Yeah, and
So
this is
basically, two-thirds.
pre-COVID.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So basically, two-thirds of the respondents were lying.
Well, I want to say they weren't lying. I want to say they were hopeful that in their mind they thought, I do go every week. And then if they really broke it down, they didn't. But you know what I
Hopeful?
mean? Hopeful. Like thinking, I'm sure I was there, wasn't I?
How much do you weigh? Well, I'm actually 260, but I'm
Yeah.
hoping to get down to 210. So I'll just say
Well,
210.
That's a
210 it is.
reality. Yeah. Hopeful lying. They're not liars. They're just hopeful. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
And I will say too, the other thing is that, for folks who receive church welfare, for instance,
Mhm.
I had when I served as a bishop, I had a segment of members who weren't exactly active, but whenever they were needing church welfare for a month or 2 or 3, whatever it
Mhm.
was, they had to be regular attenders at church. And
Yep.
so the data may even be lower than what we're saying, because some people may go sort of out of obligation and not go
Yep.
because they really want to.
Yeah, and it depends on your ward. Sometimes I had a bishop that really tracked us. Like he would call us in and say, I notice you guys haven't been there very often, you know? And I mean, I always had callings in primary. So I would miss sacrament meeting. I'd pop in at the end, kind of pretend I'd been there, and then go do my calling. So a lot of people are in, but not of the, the building, if you know what I mean. Or is it the other way around? But the data was really interesting. Here's a very interesting graph. So Pope's data can demonstrate other aspects of religious attendance as well. So, for most Christian groups at Easter and Christmas, as you see there, what happens? A huge spike, right? Those are called people who are CEO, Christmas and Easter only. Well, Mormons don't have that. And at first I thought, well, that's because they really don't have a Christmas or Easter program. But then I
Right.
realized, sorry, that's being facetious, but actually kind of true. Then I realized that really it's because everybody is there all the time. These other religions see this because that is the only time they're attending. They have a big influx, but Mormons are pretty steadily there at 15%. So, as Pope says, it's a clear sign that most of the just under 2 million people in the pews on a given Sunday are regular attendees. So, again, so interesting that cell phone data can show you this. And let's see what else we can learn from this. Another thing, okay, let me see if you guys can guess what this graph means. There's 2 times a year where the building goes dark. Do we know when that is?
Bishop's holiday.
Exactly. We're talking about October conference and we're talking about April conference. Right there you can see on the graph that nobody is there on those 2 Sundays. So this is really accurate. It's almost scary how well they can track you to find out what you're doing. So as Pope says, things go dark in terms of church attendance in their ward chapel buildings because they are all at home in their pajamas watching conference. So that's kind of interesting. Let's see what else we can learn from this. I thought this was really fascinating. One really distinctive aspect of LDS congregations was that they are the least economically diverse of all religious groups. And Pope, who did the study, he's an economist, so he was actually really surprised. It says weekly LDS attendees were, on average, a little wealthier than people who attend infrequently, which is the reverse of the pattern for other religions. And I can see that. These effects aren't super strong, but they're there, Pope said. Regular LDS church activity can be time consuming, and it feels like those that are able to get there weekly are the ones that don't have other things, like maybe a second job, interrupting their lives in certain ways, and they are often financially more stable. And I see that for sure. I mean, in the area where I live in Utah County, the church really works well for people of a certain demographic. Does that make sense? Do you guys have any comments on that thought?
Well, I think that this statistic yields itself to the interpretation that the faithful are materially blessed by God and do make more money because they pay tithing.
Yep, you could spin it that way, or you could also just say it really works for people of a certain demographic.
Hmm.
And they're all there,
Yeah.
and maybe other people aren't as comfortable being there. A trad wife, right? It kind of fits right into that.
I was thinking too, Rebecca. I mean, if you remember, Leonard Arrington made the comment that he knew from the church working for it, that you had to be in the top 15% of tithe payers in the stake to be considered for the position of stake president. And we all sort of grasp that Mormonism sort of privileges the wealthy. They tend to, at the same activity level, get better callings, such as stake president, for instance. And so I think that having more wealth and money allows you to feel better about yourself because the ward utilizes you. Whereas in other religions, there may be more conversation about how the rich should give to the poor, or more conversation that sort of add shame to wealthy people to do more with their money, to do good in the world, whereas Mormonism sort of does have that prosperity gospel.
And I would add that if you believe the prosperity gospel, and it is taught pretty much throughout the LDS church, it's in the scriptures as well, the Book of Mormon, wouldn't it make you feel kind of good about yourself if you're prosperous, just because that means that God kind of likes you better than the people who aren't so prosperous?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say 100%. And it is very hard to go to church in a scenario like that, where perhaps you're in a situation in your life. Maybe there's been a layoff or something like that. I can remember a time where I was in a situation like that. And there was a gentleman that got up during testimony meeting, and he threw his arms out and he just kind of yelled the word abundance. He yelled it a few times and he said, "I'm so grateful for the abundance the Lord has given me." And I'm sitting there in a particular cycle in my life where I don't have abundance. And it certainly doesn't make you feel great. I will say that. It certainly doesn't make you feel like you want to go back the next Sunday. So
No.
I think there's a lot of factors at play here, but that's a very interesting statistic. Here's a really interesting one. So the study has a whole bunch of other findings, says Pope. When they are in church, they stay longer than most religious groups do, 115 minutes to be precise. Well, that is absolutely not a surprise, because you have a calling. And if you're not there, everybody knows you're not there. If you're at Mass, you miss Mass the next Sunday, most people are not going to be aware that you're not there. If you have a nursery full of 15 crying 18 months old and you don't show up, they are going to call you and say, "Where are you?" They take statistics at church. They count your attendance. And I was reading a really interesting post on Reddit today about the idea of attendance. It was somebody who had been in therapy after leaving Mormonism, and the therapist was stunned to find out that they were tracked in that way, sort of monitored with attendance, that your church worship should be really private. It should be something that it is in no way tied to anything else, anything that's punitive, anything being sent to the bishop. And I guess for the rest of the world, that is kind of surprising. But to Mormons, it's part of it. You can be called in and they can say, "You aren't attending as often as you should." So I thought that was really an interesting concept. The other thing,
Yeah, this last paragraph made me wonder if they had counted Tim Ballard and his son.
yeah, well, that could be, yeah, this is really fascinating. So it says as well, well, okay, going back just a second, yes, we spend twice as much time in church as Catholics. So there you go. That's how devout Mormons are.
In your face,
And then as well,
Catholics.
what?
In your face, Catholics.
That's right. Take that. But again, we're kind of coerced and held accountable to be there in our time. So again, Mormons had the lowest rate of going to strip clubs and liquor stores. Okay, like you said, perhaps they didn't count Tim Ballard and his son. And then this was really interesting. They were about average in going to fitness clubs. I can see that. And casinos. So that's kind of unusual. They can really track you. So basically, they ping your data right there in the building, and then they see where else you go. And then they can kind of, come up with the demographic information on that. So fitness clubs and casinos.
I get
Mormons
the
are about
fitness
average.
clubs, but casinos?
I know, casinos. I didn't understand that either.
Interesting.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
Mormons might secretly be going to casinos a lot more than you would think.
I think so. Or maybe it's somebody that sat in the pews when somebody held their arms out and said, "Abundance," didn't feel very abundant, drove to the casino hoping to improve their situation. It could be
Yeah.
that. I don't know.
I recommend the craps games.
My bottom line from this entire article, Rebecca, is not only does Mormonism make liars of us all, but also when you're not using your phone, turn it off.
That is it. And that actually leads us to the last slide, which is limitations of the study, because that's accurate. Pope was quick to discuss the potential limitations of using cell phone data. What happens when someone doesn't take their cell phone to church? Well, that's not going to happen, because what else are you going to do during sacrament meeting? You've got to have your cell phone.
Pioneer
How do you
47.
exactly? Is it still Pioneer 1847 or Pioneer
It was
47?
just 47, I think. I
Just
never
a
used
47?
it, but everybody knew what it was. So they probably changed it so that,
Oh, yeah. No,
people
that's
can't be
great.
enjoying church as much anymore.
Well, I know they do go through waves where they say, "Everybody put your phones away, turn your phone off." And then they say, "No, everybody get on social media and post a picture of yourself at church." So you can't have it both ways. Anyway, also the question of how do you measure the movement of small children who don't own a phone? Again, I will say that most small children own a phone. That is just how it is. But despite the limitations, it is exciting to be able to study religious behavior using data beyond just surveys. So this will be coming out, I believe, in an article or a paper or something with further detail. But I did podcast about this on Mormonish with Simon Southerton, who had a lot to say about this. So we do have an episode about that. But it is really interesting that in this case, you can't lie. Your cell phone is turning you in. You are only going to your meetings weekly, 15% of you. So take that for what it may be.
It's interesting that Mormonism has such a hold even on the people who aren't going to church anymore that they will lie to an anonymous person in order to make it sound like they are.
Yeah.
It's pervasive.
But Mormonism has been teaching us to lie ever since we were little kids. I mean, you can take a young man, for instance, again, serving as a bishop in a ward. We had one young man who came in to see me as the bishop who wanted to confess that he was doing something he shouldn't have. I knew, having been a convert to the church and knowing some of the data out there, that every young man was pretty much doing what this kid came in to say, but he was the good kid. All the rest of them were just simply not telling it. They were simply being dishonest because Mormonism has so much shame waiting on the other side of that door. And life is just better if you pretend to be a good Mormon better than you actually are.
That's really funny because it just occurs to me now that such a structure, and indeed that is the structure, right? It's the honest ones who get into trouble with the impact that it's the dishonest ones who rise to leadership positions.
Yeah, that certainly was true for a lot of my priesthood leaders. So, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the data on that. And it does scare me a little bit that they were able to so easily gather what all of us are doing and where we're going.
Yeah.
So I'm with RFM. Maybe we should turn our phones off a little more often.
I'm going to go turn mine off right now.
Yeah, let's
You
do it.
should.